everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for SVLG's Racial Equity Across Organizations Roundtable. We are very thankful and excited to be joined by our guest speakers today, who are racial equity leaders from various sectors, to hear more about the work that they do at their respective organizations. The structure of today will start off with a moderated discussion, followed by a Q&A portion with all of our attendees. So we ask that you please be respectful and keep yourselves on mute, but very much encourage folks to ask questions in the chat box, which we'll pull later for the open discussion portion. We also will be recording, so if you'd like to keep your camera off, you are more than welcome to do so. Now, with racial equity at the forefront of our national conversation, the public and private sectors have addressed the inequalities and expanded opportunities for justice-impacted individuals. We acknowledge that the fight and the work for racial equity are not new. However, we want to take advantage of this moment where various cities, organizations, and sectors are now identifying and reimagining how to incorporate a racial equity framework. We want to see what we can do to create sustainable actions and practices to support Black and Brown communities, as well as advance and advocate for change to make us all well positioned to not only boost economic mobility for underserved groups, but to continue to support and uplift them. We have the unique opportunity this morning to hear about the work to advance racial equity in the tech, public, and higher education space. Again, we acknowledge that the work for racial equity and DEI have been ongoing for many years and have now seen new opportunities and roles to help lead the efforts. So we thank all of our speakers again today for joining us for this critical conversation. We want to continue challenging ourselves to determine how we can measure progress and success by evaluating the current systems in place and creating strategies to build and sustain a framework to incorporate racial equity into our society. So at this time, I would like to introduce my colleague in racial justice and equity, V. Grijalva, to introduce our moderator for this morning.
Thank you so much, Audrey. My name is V. Grijalva. I'm the operations manager of Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I also manage our partnerships and programs for racial justice and equity. As Audrey said, we've learned over the years that racial justice and equity and diversity, equity, inclusion have one thing in common, and that's representation. Our moderator of the hour exemplifies that. As a little Latina, I remember seeing him on TV and being so proud to see someone that looked like me breaking barriers, not only once, but twice, serving as the mayor of San Jose. Founder and CEO of Presencia LLC, which provides marketing and sales consulting services, and now the CEO of the Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley, where their mission is improving the quality of life for Latinos in Silicon Valley communities. He's nationally been recognized for his initiatives for strong neighborhoods, improved public education, and effective solutions to affordable housing and regional transportation projects. Please use your emojis or the chat box in helping me welcome Ron Gonzalez.
Oh, thank you so much, V, and happy Friday, everyone, TGIF. And certainly we want to wish you a wonderful start to Hispanic Heritage Month, which just began this past Wednesday and will last till October 15th. Hopefully you'll take this opportunity to learn more about the past, current, and future contributions of the Latino community throughout Silicon Valley, the state, and our nation. Well, I am delighted. I want to first congratulate Audrey and V and the entire SVLG team for pulling together this conversation, because I'm sure that you, like I have participated or attended many of these conversations, but this is one that crosses different sectors. Today we'll have the opportunity to hear from a panel of experts from both education, government, and the tech sector. That's kind of unusual, so it'll be interesting to see how these three sectors are approaching the issue of equity in our workplace. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's my delight to welcome and introduce our panelists. First, from the tech sector, Brandon Hicks, who's Social Justice and Racial Equity Policy Project Manager at HP Inc. Welcome, Brandon. Next is Kathleen Wong, who is the Chief Diversity Officer for San Jose State University in downtown San Jose. and an old friend of mine, Zuma Maciel, who's the director, the first director of the brand new Office of Racial Equity for the City of San Jose. So we're going to go ahead and start off with our questions and see what our panelists have to share with us today. So my first question to all the panelists are, what are your organizations doing to advance racial equity, and how are you helping execute the work in your roles? So Brandon, why don't we have you go first? What's happening with HP Inc. and what's your role there, and how are you accomplishing this work?
Good morning, everybody. So HP, we believe that diversity is like a fundamental part of like our corporate values. So whether that's gender diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, or diversity of opinion, those are things that we really, really value. And we try to exemplify that with starting with board diversity. Our board is about 58% racial minorities and about 42% women. So that was one of the areas that we wanted to start with when we think about diversity. How are the people in leadership and controlling the company? How do they look? Last year's protest started a dialogue or continued a dialogue among employees about how the company can really assert itself in a racial justice space. So we had a town hall last year and lots of ideas came from that. We made a commitment to double the number of Black employees at the company by the year 2025. So that's like a tangible, hard number that we're really standing by to increase the number of Black folks at the company. And from that town hall, we also created the Racial Equality and Social Justice Task Force. And this is really trying to accelerate the DEI work we do, but we also have come with 3 goals with our Racial Equality and Social Justice Task Force. And those 3 goals are to increase the number of Black employees, to increase the number of Black vendors we use, and to advocate on the state and federal levels for social justice policy. So that's voting rights, LGBTQ rights, criminal justice reforms. So we're trying to do a all hands on deck approach to these issues. And so that's some of the work that the company's doing. In my role, I focus on the government relations team. So I focus on identifying legislation on federal and state levels, whether that's SB2 in California, whether that's legislation on the federal level, like the Equality Act or voting rights. So that's my role. But we're really focused at HP on diversity, whether that's the board, our corporate board, or how we engage in advocacy on the state and local level.
All right, thank you, Brandon. Zuma, how about the city of San Jose? What's going on there?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for inviting me to participate on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. It really is a pleasure to talk about not only why racial equity is important, but really what local government, specifically the city of San Jose, is doing to advance this work. But before I actually get into what the city is doing, I think it's important to ground us on, what is racial equity, so that I can define, at least for the city of San Jose, what it means to us, and perhaps it might resonate to other sectors. But what racial equity means is when race no longer predicts life outcomes and when outcomes for all groups are improved. And so we aim for equity, which means that we allocating resources towards the people and the places who are most impacted and most in need. And equity is also about restoring power and resources to those most harmed by the legacy of slavery and bad policies and other harmful practices like redlining. And so when we think about advancing racial equity, why it's important is because what we recognize is that systems that are failing communities of color really are failing all of us. And so it's important for us, at least for the city of San Jose, to understand what that means for us, because while diversity and inclusion are important, they're all important pieces of this. Diversity is variety of thoughts, opinions, and variety of cultures and languages. And that's important to acknowledge that and to celebrate that. And inclusion is to actually, provide seats at the table for people, but equity is really power. And that's what we want it. We aim to get there. The other piece that I also want to mention before, because I feel like this is important to ground us and why the city of San Jose leads with race. Equity is important, but we do live in a highly racialized society, and we know that some progress has been made over the years when it comes to equity. But if you look at any measure of success, whether it be income, education, health, criminal justice, significant differences in outcomes based on race remain deep and pervasive. And that's why in the city, we lead with race. That's why we say advancing racial equity. And so part of my role as the director of the Office of Racial Equity for a large organization of over 6,500 employees is to embed the practice of centering equity, specifically racial equity, in all that we do in all parts of the organization, whether it be the airport all the way to the zoo, and at all levels of the organization. So my role is not to do the solution finding for things related to transportation or the environment or parks and rec, but it's to make sure that the organization is aware of its role in advancing racial equity so that ultimately outcomes are improved for communities who've been harmed the most in the past. And so I think later I could talk a little bit more about the framework, the principles, and the very specific things that we're doing to advance this work. But I just wanted to have at least a foundation of how we're approaching it.
Thank you so much, Zuma, for laying that foundation out. I think it's a great way to begin this conversation. Let's go to Kathleen. Kathleen, let's talk about San Jose State University and how this work is being executed there.
Thank you, Ron. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna go a little bit over some foundational stuff as well, and that is really to look at the mission of who we are. So we are a higher ed institution. We're a large public one that serves many first-generation college students. We also are an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution. And we have one of the largest APIDA populations, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American populations for universities, but many of them are first generation, many of them are Southeast Asian, many of them are Filipinx, and people who may not populate the other universities like private and the UCs in the same numbers that we do on our campus. And so we're, I just wanted to lay that out. But one of the things of being an educational institution is that we are charged with not only the things that, Zulma has talked about in terms of making sure that we are taking care of and providing opportunities for our own employees and for students, as well as for opening the door wide for employment, as well as for success for students, as well as for employees. But we're also charged with really serving as a vehicle for education and for training and for really putting out what is the most recent current research on looking at organizational transformation out into the community. And so, as you know, San Jose State, we graduate around 10,000 students every single year. They're going out into the community. We have, I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands, and I apologize, of living alumni, of many who are on this call. Who are very proud alumni of San Jose State University. But we have a very large impact through what we teach in our courses, through the ways in which we work with our students, through the ways in which our faculty do research out in the community, and the way our students intern and find careers. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that what we try to do is to really, we don't oversee all of the work on campus, but we provide a lot of leadership and resources and engage with different sectors of our community and the local community in really engaging in best practices, right? So what are the current practices? What are the ones that are promising? So for example, without going into too much detail, it's important, there's a lot of anti-bias training out there, for example, and a lot of training, and a lot of it is very generic. And so what we know is that sometimes diversity training can actually increase people's prejudices, or in the short term, and sometimes even the learning doesn't stick. And part of it is because people aren't tailoring the training so that it's recognizable to the people in terms of their own circumstances and what their goals and what their hopes and dreams are, as well as their daily operations. And so what we try to do is provide that expertise as well, so that people understand that there are tools out there, but you need a deeper understanding and self-reflection that's really important. So I see our role as providing frameworks, providing theoretical background, providing literacy for people for all of the different issues that are really important for undocumented students, for people with disabilities, for people from different religious communities. All these different types of things that we call diversity have a historical and systemic equity component. And so that's the second thing, is our frameworks are about systemic inequity, historical systemic inequity, because often those resources or those decision-making policies and patterns and practices are the ones that create slow lanes and fast lanes for people. Inappropriate fast lanes for some and slower lanes for others. And they're often invisible. They're not marked by race. They're not marked by ethnicity. They're not marked by gender. And so when we look at inequity, we really need to not look at only at data, but qualitatively, what are people doing? How are people experiencing? How do people have a sense of belonging? And what are the patterns? And then what do we do, right, in terms of working that through in terms of solutions in the organization? So.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. While you have the microphone, as they say, and you mentioned the word framework,
Yeah.
what is the racial equity framework at your organization, and what steps are you taking to incorporate it?
So there are many frameworks on our campus, I would say, because again, we're decentralized and there's a lot of wonderful diversity committees and faculty and staff who are doing great work. We've got student success centers, et cetera. But I would say for the work in our office, in the president's office, and how we support others, we have been using the MCOD model, which is the multicultural organizational development model. It is by Hardiman and Jackson. I'll try to drop something into the chat in a little bit, but it really looks at, how do you move from sort of doing token things as an organization that does token sorts of actions, or you do inclusion, diversity and inclusion, but you actually aren't actually looking at systemic change. So it's a systemic change model. It's really looking at how does an organization get to accountability, stakeholder engagement, and really a level of self-reflexivity that is systemic and systematic, so that the organization can continue to look at equity. So it incorporates accountability through data, but also through management accountability and engagement with different levels and members of the organization. So it's a 5-stage model, and so we have rolled that out through our upper management. So it's all of our associate vice presidents and above, which comprises about 50 people in our organization. So that has been rolled out, and we have plans that people have designed, and we've been evaluating those. And so it's really trying to move people from, if they're in stage 3, what do you do to move to stage 4? Or how do you operationalize some of the things that you're doing to make them more systemic, right? How do you capture what you've learned so that you don't you don't end up in activity traps where the work that you're doing is just a series of really good deeds and good things that don't actually stick in terms of institutionalization, and then you're not assessing them, or you're using a feel good marker or a no complaints marker as whether something has succeeded. And I think that it's a model that I think guides people in looking at what are we doing, or what do we need to do to move to the next level. So I'll share some links in the chat while others are talking.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Zuma, what's the racial equity framework at the City of San Jose?
Yeah, so we are fortunate to be part of a larger membership. So there are over 200 cities and counties across the US that are part of what's called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And when we started this journey in 2018, it really shared the type of framework, and it's evolved a little bit over the years, but the kind of framework that works best for local government. And so the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is GARE, you could look them up. If you're a member, you have access to the resources, but it really is geared for local governments, both local and regional and state and federal. And they've adopted the framework that I'm about to express to you. And so in a very ideal situation, you would take this phased approach, which is you start with normalizing. The normalizing phase is the first of three, and then you organize, and then you operationalize. And what that means is that in the best case scenario, you spend 2 to 3 years normalizing conversations about race, normalizing and understanding and socializing the definitions, so that when you say the words, you actually know what you mean, and you can give examples about how you might be doing this work, and that's the socializing piece. But this normalizing phase is very important. It also is the phase of training and creating a community of practice and changing behaviors. It's also a phase of doing some self-work, some self-examinations about, even in our, within our spheres of influence, the roles that we've had, how have we unintentionally or intentionally reproduced bad decision-making or poor policies or poor programs that have further harmed certain communities of color. And so you have to go through this phase. It's not, it's not just a training and all of a sudden you're an expert at this. I mean, I'm still learning, and I learn from Dr. Wong every time I hear her speak. This is an ongoing journey. And so the normalizing phase, I'm not sure that you ever really end, but there's always a transition of new people and new concepts. And so spending time in the normalizing phase is foundational to getting into this work. The self-examination, the understanding the concepts and the framework, the definitions, and what it means in terms of taking responsibility for advancing racial equity and being intentionally anti-racist, right? Challenging the policies of the programs that have harmed communities of color. And so being mindful of that. And so that's the culture change that has to take within local governments, and that mindset change and that shift takes some time. Now we don't have the luxury of spending 2 to 3 years there. There are urgent needs. And certainly last summer, with not only the COVID happening, the pandemic happening, the awakening that happened after George Floyd's death, it now illuminated the racial disparities. They've always been there, but now we're actually talking about them, right? And so this has elevated the conversations. And so the normalized phase has been accelerated. The second phase is organize. And so in a large institution like the city of San Jose, organize means a number of things. The first thing, the mayor and the city council unanimously voted to create an office of racial equity. And I'm fortunate and have the privilege and blessing to be the first director, and that was appointed in October of last year. That's part of organizing, right? So you understand these concepts, you're normalizing conversations about race, but you actually put an investment in resources in, for example, an office of racial equity that can help make some movement towards advancing racial equity in the organization. But it also means that providing, having racial equity teams in every department. It means having an external body, which eventually we're going to get to an equity roundtable. It means a number of things, but we have to get organized internally to be able to do this work. It cannot be an add-on, supplemental, collateral duty for city employees. It needs to be embedded as part of what we do, and that's part of organizing. And the third piece of that framework is operationalizing. So how do we actually put all of these things into practice? How do we change our behaviors? How do we increase our capabilities and skill set to be able to do this, whether you're in the Department of Transportation, Parks and Rec, housing, at all levels of the organization? How do we take specific projects and begin to do deep dives about this? Because unless we start operationalizing it, because it's not going to be perfect, right? But what we need to do is take projects and start asking ourselves, why do these disparities exist in housing? Why is it that mostly that the unhoused people are mostly Black and brown? And it's not just about the people. When you start to do a root cause analysis and you begin to build the skills on asking, why has this happened? I would guarantee that most of the time, it's not the people, it's the systems that have denied them access and opportunities. And when we do those root cause analysis, it begins to shift the way that we actually make decisions. And so without going, I know I've spent too much time on the framework, but it's really important to be really intentional and understand, what is the framework that we're going to adopt? And that's the framework that we're adopting in the city of San Jose, is normalize, organize, and operationalize. And then maybe I can talk later about the principles and how that's lifted.
Thank you so much, Soma. That was very, very comprehensive, both your answer and Kathleen. Let's move back to the tech sector, back to Brandon. And Brandon, can you tell us how you incorporate the community and advocacy work that you do into your racial equity roles?
Right. So prior to joining HP, I spent a lot of time working for civil rights organizations. So whether that's National Action Network, the Urban League, or NAACP, I try to keep a relationship with these organizations, these national Black organizations, to make sure that to see where we align on issues and see how we can support them. I think it's really important that you talk to folks who are impacted, and they are the voices that are leading the efforts when we try to address racial inequality, because these are not new issues, and these folks, they're experts on the issue. But as far as HP, outside of connecting with civil rights organizations, internally, we try to educate our employees. So we try to have we had a series of town halls on criminal justice and other issues that have been percolating in the culture recently. So we've had Republican and Democratic representatives on the state and federal level to come and talk about their approaches to addressing these longstanding issues. So for us, it's basically engaging with folks on the ground, seeing how we can support either financially or through advocacy, and educating our employees on the best way, on various approaches to solving these issues.
All right, thank you, Brandon. Kathleen, how are you incorporating the community and advocacy work?
So we have in the president's office, we have an office called Community and Governmental Relations Office. And we have recently had 2 hires last fall because of the priorities that were brought on, I think, about the wider awareness of anti-Black racism, as well as anti-Brown, racism and systemic racism across our country. And so we pooled resources, and the president made the decision to prioritize hiring our first director of racial justice in the office of the president in the Community Governmental Relations Office. And then in my office, we at the same time also did a search and hired our first director of Black and African American equity in our office as well. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about that is that as you're doing work out in your organizations, a lot of times what we think about is just representational equity, right? So you might say, well, Santa Clara County, for example, is only about, I think, 3.8% Black, right? And so, well, we have enough faculty, we do have enough faculty in terms of parity on our campus when you look at representation. However, what we don't have is critical mass, right? And so when we have situations where people are in extreme token situations, there is an extra burden of social psychological dynamics that happen, not just for the person who is targeted, but also for everybody else around them, right? So for example, we tend to forget that if we have a group of 5 to 6 people, or let's say 6 people in a group, so let's look at gender. If we have one woman in that group, a week later, 2 weeks later, you ask them what that woman said, or there might be something that was brilliant said, they can't track it back to the woman, right? If you have 2 women in the group, they'll remember that a woman said something, but they can't remember which woman. Even if the women look nothing alike, sound nothing alike, aren't even on the same team, they'll be like, well, one of the women said something, right? If you have 3 women on the team of like 6 or 7, the following week, we can actually, people can track back. They can provide the provenance of who said what. And so that's just an example of some of the social psychological studies that show us how tokenism, how numbers impact different groups. So different groups have different experiences in your organization just because of where they're located, the opportunities to meet with people who are different, which is why employee affinity groups or employee resource groups are so important. all those kind of things. And so part of what we do is we also, our staff, our faculty, we engage with communities. We go out and talk when people ask us to consult or to, provide, not necessarily paid consultations, but just, to talk on a panel, to work with groups. We have faculty who do a lot of work through COM University. We have a new program that we've launched in terms of research, undergraduate research program, where Dr. Andrew Carter on our campus is working with faculty to mentor underrepresented students to do community engagement type research projects so that they have generative research experiences out in the community. And that community could be in the tech sector, could be at a community organization, could be at a small business, it could be anywhere with the city of San Jose or even the county of Santa Clara. And so on our campus, we engage at different levels in terms of federal, state, certainly local and community. You've seen some of our folks out there. We also do a lot of collaborating in terms of projects and consultation. And so I think that's how we engage our student groups, and many of our faculty and staff are also highly involved and are often elected officials or liaisons to many different organizations around the Silicon Valley. And so we engage in that way as well. And I would say we also engage in the higher ed sector as well. So with the community colleges, with Santa Clara University, certainly with Stanford, with the different UCs and other folks as well, and also with K through 12. One of our strongest community, involvement, it comes from the College of Education. So they have this emancipatory educational program. A project of which I serve on as a advisory, one of many people, just fabulous faculty and students who are doing incredible work. They've had, during the pandemic, they've had open, free and accessible educational modules for K through 12 instructors throughout, not just Santa Clara County, but really whoever wants to engage. It's really looking at, uses a systemic change model of looking at education, but also uses critical race theory, critical feminist theory, and is really has been highly engaging. We've had a lot of people participating, as well as they've had a lot of free talks engaging a lot of our educators around Silicon Valley as well. And this has had a huge impact on the east side, on San Jose schools. And of course, it didn't slow down during the pandemic, which it had to go virtual and go online. So different colleges have different initiatives that they do. So sorry, I gave a very long roundabout answer. There's a lot going on in terms of community engagement.
Well, no, I think that's just fine, because I was thinking just now that between you and Zuma, your two organizations have, quite frankly, the most active participant communities, right? And who doesn't remember any time in a campus history where students weren't active? It's
Yes,
it's an everyday occurrence for you. So, and speaking of active constituencies, Zuma, how are you in the city of San Jose incorporating the community and advocacy work into your racial equity roles?
I'll try to keep this brief. We have a lot of work to do. So every department engages with community in different ways for different things, for neighborhood projects, for surveys on particular policies. So I think every department engages with community in the best way that they can, and they have relationships with community-based organizations and particular pockets of San Jose. And that's an important aspect of just the racial equity framework. So I'm going to take a step back a little bit and talk about those 4 principles, because it gets to your question. In the racial equity principles that we're applying, the first one is that we all need to be very mindful about what is really the desired impact that we want to have, and ask ourselves the questions on any program, policy, or practice. Does this harm or burden certain communities of color, or does it actually improve their lives? If there's harm and now we recognize it, what are we going to do to mitigate it, right? So what's the desired impact? The second piece is, what does the data tell us about this? And do we have the right data? Is it disaggregated by race? Is it granular, right? So the second piece is, let's look at the data. But data alone is just a snapshot in time, and it's a tool. It doesn't necessarily, it informs a decision, but it doesn't drive a decision. And I challenge that because I hear that a lot, that data drives a decision, not necessarily, not in this work. What helps inform, another very equally important, and that in a space that I feel that we need to make more investments on, is meaningful and effective community engagement, because it's a reliable research methodology. And while it's not as sexy as data, and we invest a lot of, and I'm saying we as in multiple sectors invest a lot in data managers and data groups and data sets and data this and data that, we're not doing enough around meaningful and effective community engagement, centering community voice that truly will help inform better decision making, right? That's the third principle. And then the fourth one is accountability. Where's that loop back? How do we know, right, that we're actually, these decisions are benefiting communities that traditionally, historically have been underserved or harmed? And so it gets to so what are we doing as an organization? The organization understands that we have some work to do to get to a place where we're intentional about what we mean when we engage with community. So what we hope to adopt is what's called the IAP2 community engagement model, public participation model. And I can't remember what the acronym stands for, just but I see it in my mind. And basically it's a spectrum of public participation with, on the far left, it's either you're just informing, it's one-way communication. You're telling this neighborhood group that you're going to put a new park in their neighborhood, right? And then, towards the middle of the spectrum, you're involving in the design, you're collaborating in the design, or you're really giving them power to decide completely. So we have to be really intentional about when we say community engagement, where on that spectrum are we coming to community with? Are we informing? Are we empowering? Are we involving and collaborating? And the reason that that's important is because the way that I think we need to be very mindful about how we set up the expectations when we go out to community, but really we should be moving to the power side, not just informing. We spend a lot of time asking for the community for their opinions, for feedback, for weigh in on this and weigh in on that. And now it's the city of San Jose is recognizing the importance of involving also, but also going back to community and say, this is how your input and feedback shaped this decision. And so it takes a lot of work, right? But it's also another skill set that the city of San Jose wants to acquire, and the leadership is there. And then, the fact of the matter is we have an incredible leadership team that is completely bought into this racial equity framework and principles. The middle managers are also working with their teams on trying to embed this and what they're doing. But it takes time and it takes practice. And we aspire to get to a place where the public participation is accessible and meaningful. And then the last bit I'll say about this, and Ron, feel free to jump in if I'm going too far. But there was a lesson learned for me when I was the director of the Office of Immigrant Affairs. And that was that, we really aspire to get more immigrant and refugees participating in the public process. And we thought, gosh, well, let's create a civic engagement leadership, program. And so we did. It was Spanish for Spanish speaking and for Vietnamese. And then in reflecting back on that, that experience, we were so focused on the people and trying to do leadership development there. And at the end of it, it's like, okay, that's great, but there's no pipeline to really get onto boards or commissions or actually be able to get to city council meetings at 1:30 in the afternoon when they're not accessible and they're only in English. So guess what? That was when this light came on and we thought systems change needs to happen. It's not the people we need to change. We need to adapt our systems to be able to be accessible, to provide opportunities for people to engage and meet them where they're at, whether it be in multiple languages or in times, at times that are suitable for them for specific meetings, and being mindful of the fact that people are very busy. So I'll leave you with that because I just wanted to show you an example of a systems change piece that needs to happen, I think, within local governments, not just City of San Jose, but being mindful on how are we accessible and how do we create those meaningful opportunities for the public to participate, regardless of language spoken, immigration status, able-bodied or not, right? And I think that the pandemic has exposed the fact that a virtual environment makes it much more accessible for certain communities who've been left out unintentionally or intentionally.
Yeah, thank you so much, Soma. You know, one of the things you learn when you run for mayor for 12 months is as you knock literally on every door of the city trying to get your votes, sometimes a community has an image that's not in reality. You know, that at that time, San Jose was known as a very progressive city. But when I walked day by day, precinct by precinct, and knocked on people's doors, I found that sometimes the general constituency was in a far different place. So I think it'll be interesting to see how you progress and you take your models out into the community to see what the reaction is going to be. So connected to that, I want to stick with you and ask you, you kind of alluded this towards the end of your comments. What must organizations be willing to do to address barriers, identify disparities, and monitor progress? How are you addressing that issue in a complex organization as large as the city of San Jose?
Yeah, that's a really good question because there's still so much of the normalizing work we're doing and the organizing, and not everybody has the skill set, but we're working on it to be able to understand. You can't address the barriers until you really understand what are the barriers, and rather than placing the blame on people, like I said earlier, it's really thinking deeply about a root cause analysis, and that's how you address barriers. So, I mean, I gave the example of the unhoused, and we know that about more than 57% of the unhoused people in San Jose are Latino and mostly men. Why is that? And when you start to do root cause analysis on this and to address the barriers of lack of opportunities in education or economic opportunities or substance abuse or the variety of things that happen, you can't really just throw money at a problem without addressing and acknowledging that perhaps governments at various levels are culpable for creating these disparities. And so it takes time to do that, and sometimes there's very little patience to to go through the work, but otherwise we're just going to be unintentionally reproducing the same harmful policies or make the wrong investments. And by the way, I'm not critiquing the city of San Jose. I'm talking about just local governments and state governments and federal governments. I'm talking about just government sector in general. We understand in the city that it's important to do root cause analysis to address the barriers. And we know what the disparities are. San Jose State has been, they have a lot of great data that's already been out there that we can access. We know what the disparities are, but I think what's important is that if we can get multi-sectors engaged in a conversation about what are those indicators we want to change? If we want to turn the curve on something related to education or housing or health, what does that mean for the various sectors, and what responsibility will we take to turn that curve for the better for certain communities? So I think it's not something that local government can do on its own. Addressing the barriers will require a multi-sector approach. That we put our investments, our time, and our commitment towards changing the outcomes for the communities that where we're not seeing great outcomes for. So I think that's a very high level kind of answer to that question, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that no one particular sector can address all the barriers, and that addressing the barriers really requires, as Dr. Wong said, a systemic approach to it, figuring out what have we done in the past that have created the conditions that we're seeing now.
Thank you, Zuma. Kathleen, similarly, San Jose State is like a small, medium-sized city with both your student population, your faculty, your staff, your supporting communities. What must organizations like San Jose State, other universities, be willing to do to address barriers and identify disparities and monitor progress?
So I think that first of all, you need to have the, I hate to say the right leadership, but you need to have courageous leadership. So I would say that Mary Papazian on our campus, as well as the rest of the cabinet and the deans that we have in place, we're at a place where we've got a lot of associate vice presidents, certainly a vice president in our cabinet, our president. We have leadership that I think has been asking the very hard questions, and really, we meet and have conversations with different constituents on our campus. Many of the conversations are very difficult. We work within a sector that has a systemic racism and inequity baked into the ways in which we do everything, from tenure and promotion all the way to the ways that we value specific types of scholarship and all those things. And so I think that it's important for the leadership to be able to question, but not just question, but to take action and directly talk about these issues. So Salma had said that, when you talk about racism, you've got to talk about anti-racism directly. It's not enough just to be inclusive. It's not enough just to increase diversity. It's not enough just to talk about equity in a sort of a hypothetical sense. That you really need to get down to, okay, we have these numbers, they're unacceptable. We don't have data on certain people and certain things because we don't have access to that data. It doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. Are there other ways that we can get at it? And so I think that it's important for the leadership to really have the resiliency and the, I would say, the determination to not slow down when you cannot find the easy answers or the easy tools, or people aren't cooperative, right? So part of the reason why sometimes people aren't cooperative is because they're feeling very protective, because historically institutions have not taken their information or their data or their reports and actually moved forward on it, or taken their advice, or people who are the champions end up leaving the institution, right? Because they're tired, they're exhausted, there's a bigger, better deal somewhere else. That's something we struggle with in terms of the cost of living here, of course, like everyone does here. And so I guess that's what we need. We need good leadership, but you also need to give people the tools and the literacy to be able to engage with people. And to not, something I say all the time is, just because you haven't heard anything bad doesn't mean, that nothing bad is happening. So if you're in a room and you say something and you commit a microaggression and everyone who has less power than you is smiling, that doesn't mean that something didn't happen, right? And so a lot of times we rely on our own perspectives and senses, and they're just our perspectives and senses. And so the other thing is that you need to have deep collaborative relationships with many, many different groups, so that you can learn what people are feeling and experiencing, because it may not be expressed in a public room, or it may not be expressed because of who you are. If you're the president or you're a vice president, people sometimes, it's very bimodal. You've got the courageous people who will say truth to power and say whatever they want to you, but more often than not, you've got a lot of people who will temper what they say, or sort of, hint at what is really the issue. And so providing the avenues for people to be able to give feedback that's meaningful is really important. That can be done through things like campus climate surveys. It can be done through focus groups, but it's also often done with sort of boots on the ground, just meeting with people regularly and having good relationships with different organizations, so that they can come to you when there's something that they'd like to let you know. So structuring that, as well as having the right people in place who have that mindset, is I think critical to doing this good work. The other thing is, of course, making sure that you're measuring and assessing and then reporting back out, right? So you need to have accountability. Accountability is not just giving an end of the year report, but it's also meeting with people on a regular basis if you can. The size of our campus makes it very hard to be able to do that in a way that as much as people would like. And so that's a continuing challenge for us, for many universities, and for many large organizations. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's,
No, it was great. It was great. And a lot of people don't understand that my guess is San Jose State is still pretty much a commuter university. Most, probably a
no,
higher percent. No, how
no,
about what
actually that
percentage of your
has,
students are on campus?
So we have currently 3,000 something students. We have because of COVID, it's a little bit
Right,
more sparsely
right.
populated, but we have about capacity for like 4,200 students normally on our campus. We also have conducted some, looking at people's temporary addresses and other types of data, and we believe about 70% of our students live within a mile and a half, maybe 5 miles at the most of campus.
Great.
So that's very different than maybe what it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
We certainly
Yeah.
have students that are coming in and commuting from far away, and we definitely have more faculty and staff that commuting from far
Yeah.
away, right? But for students,
I seem to recall my days as mayor, early 2000s, it was around 30%, was close by it. The rest were commuters.
yeah, so that has changed quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a hard community to involve,
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. Appreciate that. Brandon, let's go back to you. How does DEI and racial equity work together? And for those in the audience that may be new to this entire subject area, they may say to themselves, what is the difference between DEI and racial equity? Can you talk about that a little bit?
From our perspective at HP, our DEI work is really focused on making folks feel comfortable, making minority and Black employees and everyone feel like they're welcome at the workplace, right? And we're focused on things like retention and a promotion of minority employees. But the racial equity work for us, that's not internal work, that's an external work. That's trying to engage in advocacy. So when employees leave their workplace and they're in their communities, that they're living in spaces that are as equitable and as fair as we hope that HP is. So whether that's voting rights or LGBTQ rights or criminal justice reforms, those are the kind of things we're trying to change. It's an external, more societal change that we're trying to promote when we talk about racial equity. And when we talk about DEI, we're talking about the internal in-house work that we're doing to make sure that HP is living up to our values.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Zuma, you want to talk a little bit about DEI and racial equity as it exists in the city of San Jose?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Because DEI includes equity. It's just sort of a different sort of, I guess, phasing of the work. So like I said earlier, I mean, diversity is important because diversity is variety. And so, for example, in the city of San Jose, our workforce is very diverse. And it actually does represent the community quite well. We have a large Latino representation in the city organization, as well as Vietnamese, and so there's good representation across the board. And so diversity is important, right? And making sure that people feel like they belong and that there's there are opportunities. Inclusion is actually including those important voices at the table when making important and big decisions, right? So there's this component of diversity. Yes, we have it. The inclusion is, are they at the decision-making table, these diverse communities? But equity is, but are they represented in spaces of leadership, power? And so for me, there's a big difference between that, and you can't separate racial equity from DEI work. It's just part of, this thing. And I think it's important for us to think about if equity is more power and opportunity and access within the organization, we look at that as a responsibility we have to diversify leadership as well. It's not just that the organization represents the community, but that power is also representative of the community. And then also the responsibility that we have as public servants to make sure that this racial equity mindset that we need to adopt in the way that we work, the way that we examine everyday problems, the way that we find solutions, is a practice and a behavior that ultimately will provide better decision making so that our communities are better off down the road. Now, this will take time, but I guess, but back to your question. So I don't separate them. I don't think that. I think it's all it all intersects.
All right, thank you, Zuma. Kathleen, did you have anything to add on this particular subject area?
Yeah, I do. So all the things that Zulma has said, as well as Brandon has said, but I want to add that when we're talking about racial equity, it's really important for I think I would say everyone to understand that it's important for us to understand and have literacy on the historical inequities and how they pull through history for different groups, right? So some of you may have heard of the term BIPOC, so BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and then and a comma, which is really important, and people of color, right? And the reason why Black and Indigenous are placed first is because when we look at historically at racial genocide, racial aggression, racial exclusion, Black and Indigenous peoples have suffered, pretty mass genocide as well as mass, taking of lands and incarceration at rates that are really consistent through history. And we can see that it's pulled through policing, through the ways in which we discipline children in schools, through the types of microaggressions that are enacted on people that might be a little bit different, and the impact they may have just even in working groups and teams. And so it's really important, I think, to understand that when we're addressing those issues, they are particularly difficult because they are so baked into the ways in which we think of consciously, subconsciously, about superiority, about hierarchy, about who makes a better leader, about who, is, about stereotypes, all those sorts of things. And so when we're talking about racial equity, it's not just a catch-all term. The experiences of Vietnamese refugees is very different, for example, than many of the Chinese and Asian Indian Americans. And so a lot of our terms sometimes make our practices and our operations of how we enact equity very sloppy and imprecise. And so I do want to say that for all of the different types of inclusion and equity and diversity, we need to have people in the organization who have a literacy to understand, disability inequities are particularly invisible to people who are able-bodied, for example. And even though there are federal laws, and you would think because there's a very powerful federal regulation that helps with that, it's still relatively invisible because of all of the different cultural constraints that we have and what we think is normative, right? And so I do want to say that right now in this moment. Also, I do want to take this opportunity to say that, working at a university where we have 10,000, we graduate around 9,000 to 10,000 students every year, and we have new students who come in every single year at the undergraduate first year, as well as transfer student. I'll tell you right now, we have a generation that whose expectations for the rate of change and acceleration of rate of change is very different than previous generations. And so my concern, and particularly for the tech sector, my concern is that you are going to have more and more students from certain groups who are going to opt out of those careers, right? They're going to say, not doing this. We know from research, so if you look at the Kapoor Center located in Oakland, that does a lot of research on equity and diversity in the tech sector. What we know is like 6 to 7 years after women, for example, enter into the tech sector, they generally move into the softer side of the business if they're engineers after 6 or 7 years. Part of it's not attributable all to childbearing and other things and childcare. A lot of it has to do with looking up and saying I've been here 6 or 7 years and things are not going to change. I just don't want to be the only woman or one of two or the first and only surviving woman on a team. same sort of data, similar data for people of color, for engineers and people working on the tech side. People tend to go into nonprofits, so they might go into tech for schools, for example, because that feels like the mission feels better, right? It's just more you just feel like you belong. A sense of belonging is incredibly important in organizations, and I think that this is why these issues are so urgent. We don't want an entire generation of people opting out of going into the tech sector, as well as into nonprofits and other places. So I do want to say that.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you so much. I'm keeping a close eye on the clock. I want to jump ahead to a couple questions because I think they're really, really important. I think we've spent the morning kind of setting the stage, talking about best practices, all the challenges that you're all facing in this particular field in your various sectors. But, as we talked about this on our prep call the other day, the bottom line for some people, including myself, because I'm an old timer, I've been waiting around for racial equity, for decades now, all the way back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, Cesar Chavez, many, many others who what I would say were the early leaders in racial equity on a national level. And for those of us in my age group, we're sitting there, looking at all this stuff saying, so what? When are we going to see the difference? Not hear the difference or hear about what's coming, but it's kind of like, when are we going to actually see the movie where we have that scene that Zuma so eloquently painted for us about what does racial equity look like? And so this kind of brings us to this question, and that is, how are you looking towards measuring the success and progress of your work in your organizations? When and how will your picture change? And I know that both the university and the city of San Jose, I know less about HP Inc. in terms of your progress of bringing in diverse workforce. But even with the efforts you've done and the success you've had, the upper ranks of the organizations are still not reflective of what I hope you would see the picture to be at some time in the future. So bottom line, how will you measure success and when will we begin to see it? I'm gonna turn to Zuma first. The city of San Jose.
This is such a hard question. I was hoping I wouldn't be first. So we understand, before I answer your question directly, let me just add some context. So we understand that the urgency, and as an organization, we are trying to balance both the urgency and being intentional in how we operationalize racial equity in our projects so that becomes institutionalized, right? And this work is new for everyone. This is fairly nascent, right? From the federal government, state, and local, this is fairly new for everyone, and it requires patience and commitment, which will take time because there are no shortcuts to this. Decades and centuries of policies, programs, and investments or lack thereof have created the disparities that we see today. And those disparities are not going to change overnight. And so I guess how I want to answer your question related to how are we measuring this is that racial equity is both a process and an outcome. And so when I said in the beginning that racial equity is when race no longer predicts life outcomes and when outcomes for all groups are improved, right? That's the outcome we want to see. And I may not be able to see that right away, but I know that part of this is the process that I am responsible for in embedding a racial equity perspective and practice in the city organization so we get to that outcome, right? And so what we're doing to be able to measure at least this progress and is, what are, we have 5 objectives for this year, really 4 that we're working actively in. And that's number 1, under the normalize is have trainings, and we have consultants that we're agreeing that will be coming in to do some trainings citywide, but trainings is not enough, right? but we want to have a community of practice so that our practices and our behaviors are consistent based on the skills that we've learned from the training. So that's one, and measuring how well we do that over the next 3 years will be important. The second piece is when we think about operationalize, right? We're going back to that framework. Organize is how many racial equity teams, functional racial equity teams can we get across the city. So the goal is to have racial equity teams in every department in the next year, racial equity action plans in at least half of them over the next year. The third piece of this is operationalize. So we're embedding a budgeting for equity tool into this next budget process and providing training on how to do that. We did an exercise on this last spring, and it was just too broad. We casted the net too broad without any training. And so this year we're going to do a deep dive on this, several departments, to be able to apply a results-based accountability model with an equity lens on preparing budget proposals. And so when you ask about, so how do we, for me, those are the markers that are telling us, are we getting there? Because that's part of the process. And you hope that the investment in time and resources on the inputs will result in the kinds of outcomes that we want to see. But I do think it's a couple of years out, and we understand the urgency, and it's just trying to make that balance. But again, it's not just local government that's responsible for changing those outcomes. And that's why this conversation is so critical when we have multi-sectors in the room, talking about these frameworks and this terminology. And then, ultimately we should be in other rooms talking about, well, how do we change that indicator around education, health, and housing, and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Zuma. Kathleen, you want to give us a couple of your thoughts on this very quickly?
Sure. So, similar to Zulma, I mean, this is a difficult question to answer, but I do want to say that some of the things that we have traditionally measured are always going to be there. So time to graduation for our underrepresented students, as well as, their matriculation rate. A lot of what we look at is based on that, but also looking at, which are the courses that have the highest DFW, so DEF or withdrawal rates, and then, looking at closing the equity gaps in those courses, particularly entry-level courses. Some of these are things that a lot of institutions are doing. But I would say that one of the things that we try very hard to strive to accomplish is building organizational capacity for this work, right? So that means, of course, training and professional development. Are we keeping up with what the needs are? So for example, when we went to, we had to turn on a dime within a week and a half to go fully online when we first went closed down in March of 2020. Worked together with the Provost Office, put together Center Faculty Development, put together an online summer training institute that lasted 3 weeks, through courses for all of our faculty, use some of the federal funds to make sure that those faculty were supported to take this course. A mandatory portion of that course was a whole module on diversity and equity and how to make sure that what we do on the online environment, which is very different than a class environment, a face-to-face environment, that how do they address microaggressions? How do they handle facilitation? How do they assign groups? How do they do things that create a sense of belonging, and then also address racism and as well as gender inequity in their classes, right? In the online format, which is very limited. So so that's just an example. We rolled through, I think, 1,200 faculty the first round, and then another 1,000. So we're rolling through all of the faculty on that. We have mandatory microaggression, how to address and intervene on microaggressions as a supervisor training for all of our administrators on campus. We're about halfway through. We've got 3 more workshops. We'll finish training the rest of those. So we're doing it where we're rolling through staff as well. This is something that our students have asked for. This is something that our associated students have asked for, our elected officials who are students have asked for, and so this is something that we do. So I think it's accountability on the things that are being asked for and addressing the issues that people want, as well as some of the formative work that we know also needs to happen in terms of systemic equity. So I don't want to take up too much time, but certainly looking at, turnover rates for employees, equity in those areas, as well as tenure rates and promotion to full professor. All of those things are being worked on as well. And those numbers are the ones that we would look at, but we also do also gather faculty just so that we can examine their sense of belonging and their quality of life and what they need in terms of mentoring and support. So.
Okay,
Can I
thank
offer
you
that?
so much.
Thank you for reminding me, Dr. Wong. If I could just say that you're right, that the pandemic actually created this urgency and also created opportunities for ingenuity to happen in our large institutions and quickly pivot to make sure that we are supporting the people who would be hurt most by the pandemic. And I don't have time right now to go through all the examples to the Emergency Operations Center and the thing when we embedded racial equity, because we used the framework within EOC. It was clear for us where we needed to invest our time and resources to get those financial relief checks out to the people who needed it the most. And for us, it was undocumented people who were not getting state or federal checks, stimulus checks. And then we needed to go where they were at. We needed to use WhatsApp, and that online stuff wasn't working for us. And so we immediately had to look at ways that we were going to be able to support those communities. And so that's a more, it's an example that I could give you today on how we're beginning to turn the curve on the way that we respond.
Yeah, even a simple thing like don't turn on your, allow students to not turn on their camera during class and don't take it personally, because some students were actually zooming into their class from their cars outside of Starbucks because they didn't have access to a space in their home, for example, right? Those kind of things, right? So just thought I'd tell you that there's these realities that have to be taken care of immediately, right? So, yeah. Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists, Brandon, Kathleen, Zuma. Let's go to the audience now. I'm going to bring back Audrey to maybe take a couple questions from the chat room. Audrey?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ron. So there were a few questions that were dropped, one of which was, I'm curious about some of the interventions organizations are using to impact behaviors and output in functional work. Are there any templates, guiding questions, or decision-making protocols that you can all share?
Okay, and let's just one of the panelists just jump in and answer the question if you'd like. Who would like to answer this one? If you don't jump in, I'll call on you. I got to. I'm the moderator.
Can we hear the question again?
Yeah, so the question is about the curiosity around like interventions or the discussions that organizations are having to impact behaviors and output in functional work around racial equity. So are there any templates, guiding questions, or decision-making protocols that you are either using or referencing when having these conversations?
So I can talk to one, I don't know if it's a template, but I can talk to one practice or something that we talk about in a lot of our training and consulting on campus, and that is that when we are in intergroup evaluation or assessment situations, right? So if you're doing an annual review of somebody, or you are evaluating ideas in a work team, right? And of course, when you're there, you know who's saying what, right? So just to sort of assume that we have these unconscious biases that operate so that we're not able to accurately recall the details of what people have said in a way that's useful, right? So for example, in a job search, you will, you'll deliberate about a candidate, and then if that candidate is from the majority culture or from your culture, you'll tend to remember all the details of what they have done. And then evaluate that they're a great candidate. If the person is from an underrepresented group, you'll tend to remember they're a great candidate, but you don't remember the details. So next week, when you go look at the files, you're going to say, yeah, well, Brianna was a superstar, and Josh was a superstar, and he also managed 5 teams, and blah blah blah. If Brianna's a woman, or Brianna is Black or Latinx or something else, and you're white, or you go with the majority culture because this is the way you've been taught and socialized, you're going to remember that Josh had managed 5 teams, even though Brianna might have managed 6 teams. You don't recall the details. So what we do in terms of a methodology is to tell people to slow down their thinking And so what research shows is that you make people take notes, even if they have a fabulous memory, you give them templates to take notes to write down evidence. And then when the next week comes and you're going to review those files, you actually make everyone go back to their notes instead of just recall. Because our recollection is imperfect, and it is done the ways in which we have been schooled, the ways in which we were given praise in schooling, all those things we model on that. So that's one way. Slow down thinking means to make sure that people write things down and they go back and refer to them when you deliberate, and you don't let people deliberate without going back. And that's time consuming, but it's a good cognitive nudge and a good cognitive habit to do that. So that's something I can share. It's, fairly simple in some ways. It applies in many situations. So any evaluation situation doesn't have to be a job search, but we're evaluating good ideas, for example, on a project or something. And that also increases innovation and the ability of people to speak up and say, hey, you know what, my idea was actually deliberated on very thoroughly, even though I'm a junior person or I'm a new to the team. And so therefore, or I'm a person of color, and they're actually deliberating. That will give people confidence to contribute, and that increases innovation as well. So.
Thank you, Kathleen. Audrey, do you have another question?
Yes, the last question that was asked has like two parts to it. So this one is open to you all to answer, and it's asking to speak on the accountability measures that you have in place for those responsible for reaching equity goals. If you don't reach your goal, what is the feedback loop or process to reevaluate look like?
So I'll answer that. So as a part of our racial justice and our racial justice and social equity task force, quarterly, we have a report on the 3 goals that we have, and that's Black employee retention, that's vendors, Black vendors we're using, and advocacy. And so we report quarterly about the progress we're making on these goals, and that goes to our CEO Enrique. So like there is definitely like some accountability with these goals, these broad and ambitious goals that we have. Like there's quarterly and yearly like review of whether or not we're hitting those metrics.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Anyone else want to comment on that question? I'm assuming that's very similar in other organizations, but Zuma, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would say that every department in the city has sort of the goals that they're aiming for. And so there's the accountability there. And so for the Office of Racial Equity, we're so much in the initial stage right now. We're almost coming up to a year, and a lot of it is process oriented and operational and tactical rather than strategic. But I will say that we are on our way to incorporate what's called results-based accountability model, which is what we're testing in the fall through the budget process. And but even if you haven't had that training before, and we're going to go through a series of trainings with very targeted departments that are very public facing. I guess to answer parts of that question about the behaviors, what we're trying to have people reflect on is asking just some very basic questions, whether they're designing a program or they're developing a policy, or it's an internal practice, is to ask, who benefits from this thing that you're proposing, and who might be burdened, and how do you know that? And so, and sometimes that's why I said earlier that sometimes we reproduce bad policy, because it's just so easy and convenient to think that we make an assumption about things. We say, well, that's just the way that we've always done it, but that just seems like the right thing to do. And so even asking yourself, who's burdened and who benefits, and how do you know that? And if you know that there's a particular group, whether inside the organization or the public, that might be burdened by this particular policy, what are you going to do to address it? How are you going to mitigate it? And so whether or not you've had the training or not, I would offer that asking yourself that same question, regardless of where you are in the organization, it's good to pause and reflect on it, because I think we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on the experience and reflecting on these types of important questions for ourselves and for our teams. And I think the city leadership has embraced that. I know. And it's so without the proper training, because there's some hesitation about, I might get this wrong. Yeah, we're probably going to get it wrong along the way. It's not going to be perfect. It's very messy. It's not linear, but we need to ask ourselves at least those basic questions. And that's what we've included in the previous budgeting for equity worksheet.
All right, thank you, Zuma. I'm gonna just wrap this up now and ask each of our panelists to take maybe 60 to 90 seconds to give us any of your last thoughts, anything that came up that you were thinking of during this panel discussion, anything you would like to leave the audience with in terms of your efforts or your dreams around this area. So let me go first to Brandon Hicks. Brandon?
Hi. So last year was a really hectic year for everybody with the pandemic and all the protests around George Floyd's murder. And so conversations are great, but it's really, at least from our perspective at HP, it's really time to get numbers, get metrics, meet deadlines, and to really hold ourselves accountable to deliver for folks, right? I think folks are kind of tired of conversations and trainings, and we want to be action oriented. So I think that's really what I would want to leave folks with, is to focus on to hard numbers, ambitious goals, and really try to stretch yourselves to meet those goals.
Kathleen?
I would like to say that, one thing I think that's difficult in a setting like a panel where we have really wonderful and grateful that I was invited to this panel, and really appreciate the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and all the leadership. But I think one of the things that's difficult is to really talk about intersectionality in a meaningful way in this sort of context, right? And so a lot of the work that we're doing, I would say that one thing I want people to look at is that when we think about the multiplicity of identity and which folks are maybe the most severely impacted, one group we haven't talked about, for example, are LGBTQ folks, and in terms of really, especially when we look at the violence of trans people of color, right? So when we look at what's happening in our communities, and even within communities of color, it's really hard to do this work when there is so much inequity and need that a lot of times people latch on to, one issue or one thing that they want corrected, or I just want this to change. And they're not really looking at sort of the collective, even within their own community, what are the collective things that need to happen so that everyone feels that they are safe, feels that they belong, feels that they can have the things that's almost as where, you can make mistakes and you can do well and not have it attributed only to your identity, right? Or your entire group. Those are things that are really, those are the hard questions. And so when we're, I need to always challenge myself to make sure that we are also looking at intersectionality. It's not just having identities stacked upon each other, but there are some identities, when they intersect in our society, they are particularly toxic and often deadly, right? And so I do want to say that as sort of a, sorry to close on a downer, but I do think that it's really important to talk about that, as well as how disability communities, even some of the some of the materials that we hand out and everything, a lot of the materials nationally tend to feature people who are white, for example, right? And so a lot of times communities of color don't see themselves, or parents of children who want to advocate for them don't see themselves, right, in a lot of these services that are provided as well. So I just want to challenge us to think about intersectionality in a meaningful way, as hard as it is to do that. So.
Thank you, Kathleen. Suma?
Yeah, I wish we had more time to talk about the intersectionality piece. I'm not an expert in it, but I will say that we acknowledge the intersectionality and the different identities, and the importance of, really at the end of the day, when we ask about communities that will be burdened or benefit by a certain policy or program, it could be gender, it could be LGBTQ, it could be different able-bodied communities, it could be non-English speakers. And so there's a lot of that reflecting. And that's why at the beginning I said we lead with race, because even in those intersections, even in those different identities, by and large, you're going to see that certain communities of color are still, there are more disparities even there, right? And this isn't a trying to see who's suffering the most or who's oppressing the most. it's just understanding that this is very complex and that we have to have a larger conversation. And I'm glad somebody brought it up in the chat about the intersection, intersectionality. And so I guess because I know we're in the final few minutes here, I guess I would just offer that change happens at the pace of trust. And if we're thinking about fundamental institutional change and we want it to be sustainable well beyond the time that we're in these organizations, we need to make sure that we bring as many people along. And sometimes that trust happens one conversation at a time. And I know we don't want to hear more conversations, but we have to get everybody on board to be able to do this so that we can then propel this thing further and advance it faster, accelerate the rate at which we advance racial equity. And so I think both. I don't think we need to wait for one to happen before the other. I think it's important that they happen simultaneously and are consistent, and that we bring as many people along as we can. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Zuma.
Can I say just one more thing? I just want to say that here at San Jose State, I hope that people see us as a resource. We have so many faculty, so many staff, so many students, and so many of your former, our former students who are graduates who, are really well versed in working on issues of equity. And so I want you to see, we are a public university. And so we are a public resource, just to let people know. I just want to say that. Yeah.
Great reminder, Kathleen. Thank you. If I can ask our audience to use their emojis to thank our panel, fantastic conversation. Really, really appreciated you giving us your time and your thoughts this morning. Let me just say one thing or a couple of things before we turn it back to Audrey to wrap up the morning. I have learned a great deal from these panelists over the last couple of days and this morning, and I certainly know that the work that they're involved with is very complex and real, very real, and is constantly changing day by day. But I'm also, as I shared with them the other day, I'm reminded of the old Dr. Martin Luther King quote that said that justice delayed is justice denied. And I would just amend that a little bit today's thinking in saying that equity delayed is equity denied. And we don't want to deny equity much longer. And so when it comes to your work, and this is why I'm glad to hear your answers to the question that we asked towards the end around performance and outcomes. And I was glad to hear Brandon's comments about how they're measuring outcomes at HP Inc. I always like to use the phrase that your actions are so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. And I think those of us that have been around this subject area for decades want to see a lot more action and a lot less talk, as Elvis Presley used to say. So with that, thank you again, panelists, for cooperating with me. You're a great group to work with. Audrey, back to you.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you again, Ron, Brandon, Kathleen, and Zolma, for taking the time to join us today for this critical discussion as we continue the work to advance racial justice and equity. Your leadership is important as we continue this collective fight through all the intersections, all the ways in which we can collaborate in this ongoing partnership and journey. So thank you all again for the work that you have done and continue to do. And thank you all for joining us today for Racial Equity Across Organizations Roundtable.